On the outside, the Mackintosh House is a brutalist concrete building of the 1970s. Inside, it's another world. How did this puzzling contrast come about? These extraordinary interiors come from the last Glasgow home of renowned Scottish architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his artist wife, Margaret Macdonald.
The house is a work of art, but it was also their home, backdrop to the careers of these two remarkable artists.
Mackintosh was born in Glasgow in 1868. With its shipyards and engineering works, Victorian Glasgow was one of the great industrial cities of the world. Its wealth and dynamism were expressed in the ambitious architecture of its bustling streets. Mackintosh grew up in the East End. His childhood home was in the shadow of the necropolis, where monumental tombs commemorated the city's leading families. It was a stimulating place for an aspiring architect, and at the end of his apprenticeship, he joined the local firm of John Honeyman and Keppie as a draftsman. Along with fellow draftsman Herbert McNair, Mackintosh attended evening classes at the Glasgow School of Art. There, they met the sisters Margaret and Frances Macdonald. The four young artists discovered a shared outlook and were immediately recognised as a group.
Mackintosh was enrolled in the night school of the art school's architecture department for 10 years. It put him in touch with people who made things, and it must have given him an impetus and an insight into people who made things.
Mackintosh developed a highly personal approach to architectural design. His buildings show the influence of traditional Scottish architecture and the arts and crafts movement. Like most Victorian architects, he was fascinated by the past, but he aimed for a new architecture in which light, space and proportion were key.
All of his furniture is made for a specific person or a specific room. Its form is partly dictated by that room because it's an extension for him of the architectural manipulation of the space.
In 1900, Mackintosh and Margaret Macdonald married. It was a creative partnership. According to their friend Alice Morris, they worked and thought so much together that I have often thought I recognised in the work of either some impress of the spirit of the other. They rented a flat at 120 Main Street in the centre of Glasgow, and together they transformed its Victorian interiors.
The house is a showpiece for their work, but it also illustrates their collaborations in certain of the objects in the house. White desk that has the silver panels by Margaret Macdonald, the fireplace and flanking bookshelves that has her beautiful gesso panel above it, the bedroom suite that Mackintosh had designed in 1900 for their marriage. So there are these connections between them as a loving couple, not just as a collaborative artistic partnership.
Margaret contributed panels of beaten metal, embroidered textiles, and arrangements of dried flowers like abstract sculptures.
We don't know very much about how the Mackintoshes entertained, but there's a lovely account of Christmas time in the studio drawing room. The nieces and nephews came, and Mackintosh had tied different coloured wools around the furniture, and they had to pursue their coloured length of wool until they got to their present. And then there were screams and yelps of delight, and Mackintosh apparently joined in as well.
Photographs of the flat were published in the influential art magazine The Studio, and the Mackintoshes gained an international reputation as avant-garde designers. But life in the noisy, dirty city centre was oppressive, and in 1906 the couple moved to Hillhead, a leafy suburb in Glasgow's affluent West End. They bought a Victorian terraced house, number 6 Florentine Terrace, later renamed 78 Southpark Avenue, and transformed it to embody their creative ideals. In many ways, the house was a new version of the Main Street flat. Mackintosh made some structural changes, but the furniture, light fittings, and even the fireplaces were brought from Main Street and reinstalled at Florentine Terrace. A friend described visiting the Mackintoshes in their unique house. The feeling of restful space in that narrow hall was extraordinary. Following the maid to the first floor, I was shown into a large L-shaped room. Mackintosh's supreme skill was his masterly handling of space. This room was the shrine he had made with love for his artist wife Margaret and himself, the nest to which they fled for rest and refreshment from the bitter horrors of commercial Glasgow. The room was all ivory white, but the dominating feature was a splendid window at one end facing southwest, made, as my host told me, for my wife, Mistress Margaret, so that she can watch the sunsets. The little house at Hillhead was a unity, perfect from top to bottom. It was while living here that Mackintosh's greatest achievement, the library wing of the Glasgow School of Art, was completed in 1909. But Mackintosh's architectural career was already faltering, and in 1914 the couple left for England. With the outbreak of the First World War, what had begun as an extended break became a permanent move. Their final years were spent in London and the south of France, and they never returned to Glasgow to live. The house was bought by William Davidson, a successful Glasgow businessman. 20 years earlier, he had commissioned Mackintosh to design a villa at Kilmacombe called Windy Hill. It was a landmark in Mackintosh's architectural career. The Davidsons and their 3 children had been close friends of the Mackintoshes, and William Davidson was a loyal supporter of the artist couple. Under the Davidsons, Mackintosh's furniture remained in everyday use and was carefully preserved. After their deaths, their sons presented the furniture to the University of Glasgow, who bought the house to use as professors' lodgings. In 1963, and amid much controversy, the university demolished the house to make way for campus expansion.
In the lead up to the demolition, it was Andrew McLaren Young, who at that time was Professor of Fine Art, who had an enlightened vision that these interiors, which he understood to be extremely internationally important, should be saved for the long term. So under his careful leadership, the interiors were dismantled, recorded, and put into storage. And at the same time, a thorough record, photographic and measured survey was undertaken to enable their future reassemblage.
At long last, we are now going to have the Mackintosh House reconstructed, and it'll be adjacent to the new art gallery which the university is planning. One crosses one's fingers on this sort of thing, that work will start on this site, and eventually out of the mess will emerge the reconstructed Southpark Avenue house.
William Whitfield, architect of the university's new Hunterian Art Gallery, designed a self-contained wing that exactly replicates the shape of the demolished house. This building, with its ghostly external echoes of the lost Victorian house, was constructed between 1973 and 1981. Into this concrete container, the preserved interiors from the Mackintosh's former house were carefully inserted.
One of the most challenging and fascinating aspects of the whole project was putting the interiors together again. And for that we had very sparse information, and we also had access to a few people who had visited the house. Without doubt, the most interesting and the most valuable source was Mary Newbury, daughter of the School of Art headmaster. She was an artist and a maker and a needleworker, and had a very fine sense of fabric and texture. And it was always rather daunting to go to her with some of the linen samples that I'd sourced and see what she thought, and she'd say, too thick, or not transparent enough. So she was a benchmark for much of that aspect of the reconstruction.
The detail And the research that's gone into, for instance, the decoration of the dining room is very clever and is a compilation of people's memories, other Mackintosh projects, and a few square feet of a sample of the original wallpaper, which Mackintosh had painted himself probably, which had survived. It's, I think, a very good reconstruction of what a Mackintosh has had. And it works. No one's really aware of being inside a modern building from the inside.
The internal layout is the same as the original house, and since the location is only 100 metres from the site of Florentine Terrace, and the new building faces the same way, the fall of natural light within the rooms is more or less unchanged. The spaces in which these two remarkable artists lived and worked can be experienced at first hand. And the long, low drawing room window which Mackintosh designed for Margaret still looks towards the sunset.